Picture the capital of the United States. You instantly see it, right? America's most famous residence. But what if I told you that its defining feature, the very thing it's named for, was basically a massive accident? Seriously, a total budget hack. So, we're kicking off this explainer with one huge question. Why is the White House actually white? Because I guarantee you, almost everything you've probably heard about this classic piece of history, it's completely backwards.
I mean, most of us grew up hearing the exact same famous myth, right? That the building was painted bright white to cover up these ugly scorch marks after the British set it on fire back in 1814. Well, actually, scratch that. Here is the actual fact. The building was whitewashed in 1798 as a cheap weatherproofing sealant. The famous color has absolutely zero to do with hiding fire damage. In fact, it was brushed on 16 full years before the British even showed up in Washington.
Section 1. The Cancel Palace and the Secret Contest. Okay, to really wrap our heads around why it's white, we've got to hit rewind to 1792. The original architect, Pierre L'Enfant, well, he had a wildly different vision. He actually designed this massive presidential palace. We're talking nearly 5 times the size of the building you see today. He even broke ground, but he stubbornly refused to share his blueprints with the commissioners. Eventually, President George Washington just ran out of patience and fired him. So the giant palace design died right then and there, leaving nothing but this embarrassing, gaping basement excavation right in the middle of America's brand new capital. Scrambling to fix this mess, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson ran a public replacement contest with a $500 prize. Get this, he actually entered it himself in secret, using just the initial A, and he still lost. No way, right? The winner was James Hoban, an Irish-born architect who pitched a much smaller, way more budget-friendly house. But here's the kicker. Because they'd already dug that massive hole for L'Enfant's canceled palace, they literally had to build Hoban's shrunken house directly inside the oversized bones of that original dirt pit. Section 2. Building the People's House. Now, let's talk about who actually built this thing. Initially, the plan was to bring over laborers from Europe. But yeah, those recruitment efforts completely flopped. The pay wasn't great, and Washington was essentially just a half-built swamp town at the time. So, facing super tight deadlines, the commissioners had to rely on a highly diverse, though deeply unequal, workforce. We're talking enslaved laborers, free black laborers, local white artisans, and some highly skilled Scottish stonemasons brought over specifically to cut the stone.
And the reality of this workforce, it's preserved right in the primary sources. The 1795 payroll records explicitly name enslaved laborers working on the site: Tom, Peter, Ben, Harry, and Daniel. Astonishingly, 4 of those men were actually owned by the architect himself, James Hoban. All told, over 200 known enslaved individuals worked on the White House and the Capitol, doing incredibly grueling work, like hacking out sandstone blocks at the government quarry. It's a sobering fact that really humanizes the true cost of what we call the People's House.
This created a pretty jarring reality on the ground. Enslaved and free workers alike lived in these crude, temporary dirt floor huts thrown together right along the north side of the property. Meanwhile, just yards away, they were raising this massive, intricate stone mansion. The sheer contrast between the harsh, completely unvarnished living conditions of the builders and the grand ambition of the stone project they were actually constructing is just staggering.
But even with all this labor, the construction itself was a total nightmare, plagued by material shortages, and, frankly, having no money, Hoban was forced to slash his already scaled-down design. First, he limited the basement level entirely. Then he shrunk the house from 3 main floors down to 2. To pinch pennies, they even used cheaper, site-made brick to patch sections of the stone facade. They even deferred interior finishes like plaster and paint and entire wings just to keep the project breathing. And it's exactly this relentless budget cutting that leads us right to the building's famous exterior.
Section 3. The real reason it's white.
So by 1798, the builders were practically out of cash, and they had a major structural crisis on their hands. The aqueous sandstone they used for the exterior walls was incredibly porous. This put it at a huge risk of cracking when the freezing winter temperatures hit. To protect it on the cheap, they used whitewash, and you know what? That's not even real paint. It's this inexpensive mixture of lime, rice glue, and casein. Basically, it was a cheap sealant brushed onto the stone, purely for structural protection, not for aesthetic looks. So yeah, the White House is white because they literally just needed a budget-friendly winter coat for the rocks. What's really fascinating here is the timeline of the name itself. So in 1798, that protective whitewash goes on. By 1810, newspapers are already tossing around the term White House informally. Then 4 years later in 1814, the famous fire happens. Let that sink in. The public was already calling it the White House 4 full years before the British ever set foot near it. And it wouldn't even become the official name until Teddy Roosevelt put it on the presidential stationery in 1901, over a century later.
Section 4. The Fire of 1814. Now, even though the fire didn't cause the white color, the burning of the Capitol is still packed with its own crazy historical twists. As British troops marched into Washington in retaliation for an American raid up in Canada, First Lady Dolly Madison famously stayed behind. She absolutely prioritized saving this irreplaceable, full-length portrait of George Washington. But here's the question, who actually saved it? Because the frame was heavily screwed to the wall and they were literally out of time.
Well, while Dolly made the crucial call to save it, actually getting it out required a frantic team effort. A 15-year-old enslaved teenager named Paul Jennings, working alongside the steward and the gardener, had to physically break the frame apart and slice the canvas free with a knife. I just can't shake that incredible, terrifying image. A teenager furiously cutting a president's portrait out of its frame while a foreign army is actively closing in on the city.
So the British arrive, they actually sit down and eat a meal in the abandoned kitchen, and then they set the building on fire. The whole interior burns completely. But get this, the very next afternoon, a sudden violent tornado rips right through Washington. Literally a freak weather event. It actually killed several British soldiers and forced the commanders to abandon the city. And most importantly, the torrential rain from that storm doused the flames, leaving those scorched sandstone walls structurally sound enough to be rebuilt.
Section 5. Restraint, not ambition.
After the fire, Congress actually debated just moving the Capitol entirely, but they ultimately decided to rebuild. So they bring back a now 50-something James Hoban to oversee it from basically scratch. He had to restart that incredibly slow, painstaking Scottish stone-cutting process all over again. And remember, the government was still absolutely broke. It was so bad that when President James Monroe finally moved into the restored house in 1817, he had to spend nearly 10 grand of his own personal money just to furnish the incomplete interior so it looks presentable. Congress didn't even fully pay him back until years later.
Honestly, it took an unmatched level of dedication from Hoban. I mean, he laid the original cornerstone back in 1792. He was brought back for the reconstruction in 1814. He engineered the South Portico in 1824, relying totally on brick and stone vaulting since structural steel wasn't a thing yet. And then in 1829, he begins the iconic North Portico, finishing it just before his death. Hoban stayed tied to this one address for almost 40 years. He outlasted other famous architects and multiple presidents, slowly piecing together the iconic profile we all recognize today. When you think about it, America's most photographed house exists specifically because a much grander one got canceled first. What all of this really proves is that restraint, endless budget cuts, and highly practical solutions, like slapping on a cheap 1798 whitewash just to keep stones from freezing, that's what actually built this iconic landmark, not some boundless ambition. Every single expensive version got rejected and replaced by whatever this young country could actually afford at the time.
And that wraps up our explainer on this wildly fascinating history. But you know, it leaves me with a huge question for you. If the White House's most defining feature is really just a misunderstood budget hack, what other famous landmarks are out there hiding similarly surprising truths just waiting to be uncovered? Keep questioning what you think you know, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.